I'm sitting down with Ben Jamal, director of Palestine Solidarity Campaign, one of the biggest pro-Palestine organizations in this country and maybe in the West. Over the past 20 months, the PSC has managed to mobilize the biggest protests in the British history. PSC has brought hundreds of thousands of people, of protesters from all across the country to support Palestine, to protest against the Israeli genocide in Gaza. And today we're going to talk to Ben Jamal about these protests and the strategies that the PSC is taking forward. Ben Jamal, thank you very much for joining me.
It's a pleasure to be here, Ahmed.
So let's start talking about these protests, because I have to be honest with you, especially after I lost my family. And you know, I lost 21 members of my family. I was devastated after losing my family. But every time I watch these protests, every time I see these hundreds of thousands of people who flock to London, who come to protest and to show their solidarity and the support for the Palestinian people, that gives me hope. So I want to ask you about these protests, as you are one of the main organizers of these protests. How did you feel every time you call for a protest and then see hundreds of thousands of people protest and come and answer your calls?
Yeah, well, I mean, when we began and we called the first protest, the first march took place a week after October the 7th. So we called it for October the 14th, because we knew already on October the 7th, anyone with any sense of history knew two things. We knew that history hadn't begun that day. You know, we've been protesting for many, many years with a whole range of different tactics. But we knew what history told us, how would Israel respond to October the 7th. We knew that many, many thousands of Palestinians would be killed. Many were killed on the first day. None of us obviously would have anticipated the scale of what was coming, and that we would actually witness a live stream genocide. But that first protest, I think whenever you call a protest, you want it to be, for protests really to have impact. And maybe we'll talk about what's the impact, what's the purpose of them. But when you're organising a national protest, for it to have impact, you need a lot of people turning up. And historically, 2014, we saw 100,000 people marching. 2021, we had, on the two protests we held during Israel's assault on Gaza in 2021, the summer of 2021, we saw 150,000, then 200,000. So we were, I think, in those early protests, astonished at the size of the response. Very, very quickly, we were getting up to 500,000 then in November.
Did you expect that before organizing these events?
No.
No.
And look, I did an interview with Al Jazeera, I think it was, 6 months before October. At a time where Israel was escalating its killing of Palestinians in the West Bank. You know, and people forget, between January and October, I think over 200 Palestinians were killed in the West Bank. Was expanding its colonization, the West Bank, still threatening annexation. So, but none of that was grabbing attention. And I got asked a question: if you called a protest now, do you think you'd have the numbers? Or if there wasn't another assault on Gaza, do you think you'd have the numbers that protested in 2021? Now, I'm the director of the PSC, so I have to give an answer and say, yes, you know, the work that we've done means we can mobilize those sort of people. But in my heart, I thought, I don't know, actually. We, at that point, been through many, many years of repression of the movement, of an attempt to demonize the movement, increasing repressive actions by the police against activists. All of those risk having a chilling effect. So generally, do I think we would get the size of the response in terms of the amount of people marching? Possibly not. But secondly, none of us, I think, if you'd said to me, do you think you'll still be marching in 20 months' time? And if you are, do you think you'll still be having 500,000 people come out and march?
You wouldn't expect that.
I wouldn't have expected it. A, because I don't think, with everything, I mean, I could ask you, with everything you know about Israel's capacity, with all of our knowledge of decades of colonization, of ethnic cleansing, of establishment of apartheid, of systematic and periodic massacres, of the mass imprisonment of Palestinians, if someone has said to you, actually this will now extend into a full-blown genocide that will kill tens and tens of thousands of Palestinians, and it will be live streamed, and there will be, you know, children burning alive across our screens, and it will continue for 20 months. The world will allow it to continue for 20 months. Would you have thought that's a possibility? I would have probably thought, with everything I know, no, there are still some bulwarks in place across the system of international law that will make that intolerable, not sustainable, and pressure will come on Israel, meaningful pressure to stop.
Do we know how many people showed up to our protests during the past 20 months? Because I know that in one of the protests, one of the Saturdays, almost 1 million people showed up. So do we know how many people protested for Palestine over the past 20 months across the UK?
Well, if you're looking, I mean, if we're just taking the national protests, and we're now on 26 or 27, and I think we did somebody did a calculation of tallying the total, which I think, I'll have to check this, was something like 6 million people we think have marched, over 6 million. But obviously that's
10% of the British.
I know, they're not all separate people.
Yeah.
But, you know, the largest marches, the one we held in November, had 1 million people. We've had a number that have had 500,000. Our last march, the Nakba March on May the 17th, had 500,000 people attending. We've not had one of the national marches that in our estimations had less than 100,000 people. But then if you're asking the question, how many people have protested across the UK, alongside those national marches, we've organised regional marches, protests. We've moved to a pattern of spacing out the national demonstrations and calling for, and I'll talk about the range of actions, because we're not just marching. But in terms of people just attending protests, street demonstrations, those have continued to happen in towns and cities across the UK. So we're talking, you know, a total of many, many millions who've participated in this.
And Ben, I should say that I am one of the privileged Palestinians to speak at these protests. I spoke at the national protests. You invited me to speak there, and I spoke at many other protests across the country, from the north to the south. And it was empowering, actually, to stand up in front of all of these people and to represent Palestine, to speak about the Palestinian narrative and perspective. It is really empowering, and it's really amazing. But one of the times I was speaking there, and I looked, and one of the time I spoke, there were 250,000 people at least at that protest. And I had this in my mind, I was thinking, how much work and pressure did you have to go through to organize all of these masses? Tell me about the process of organizing a protest.
I mean, it's a huge volume of work. It demands like a huge infrastructure. You need, for example, you know, you're leading hundreds of thousands of people through the streets, which means, you know, we've always taken the view, we don't cooperate with the police, but we liaise with the police. Because if you want to march through the streets, you want to put up a big stage so people can see and hear speakers, which we think is an important element. Then you need your roads closed. You need to have a space where you can put it up. And sometimes the police will have legitimate reasons for saying, no, we don't want you going that way because there's a carnival happening or this is happening. So you need to do that. And that process has become quite torturous, because obviously what the police have sought to do under pressure from the political establishment of which they're a part from the very beginning is find mechanisms to try to suppress the marches, imposing conditions, changing the conditions at the very last minute. So that's a fairly torturous process. You then need to have a big infrastructure. We have now a volunteer pool of several hundred people who will come and steward the demonstrations. And that's a big exercise. It's not just making sure the march is able to process, goes in the right direction, is making sure at every tube station there are people being guided to where they go. At most of the marches we have pro-Israel demonstrators who want to do a counter demonstration. We need to make sure they're kept away from the people marching. So there's a big sort of infrastructure of people that need to organise. And then there's a lot of effort. You have to mobilise, you have to encourage people. We have PSC has a network now of 100 branches, and they do a lot of the work. They're out in towns and cities giving people the message about what's happening. But that's not all they're doing, and we'll come on to talk about the wider range. But yeah, it's a huge logistical exercise. But it matters because part of the purpose of the marches, and maybe we'll talk about that. Why do we do them?
Yeah.
But for for national demonstrations, they don't work unless you have a very big crowd. If we were marching and we had 10,000 people marching, it would not be fulfilling the purpose that these marches need to fulfill.
At Palestine Deep Dive, we're committed to producing honest, in-depth journalism which centers the Palestinian voices too often ignored by the mainstream media and only interrogated when they're rarely given such a platform. And instead of just complaining about the mainstream media bias when it comes to reporting on Palestine, we are on the front line building the alternative, building the solution. Help us strengthen independent Palestinian-led new media by becoming a subscriber to Palestine Deep Dive now from as little as £2 a month. A few weeks ago, I was sitting down with many Palestinians and pro-Palestinians, pro-Palestine activists here in the UK, and we were having like this internal talk about what are we doing here? We are witnessing a genocide. And one of my friends said that he only attended 2 protests at the beginning, and then he stopped. He stopped attending these protests, and he's a Palestinian from Gaza who lost many family members. I don't need to say his name, of course, but that gave me a sense that people are in a huge despair. And then I told him, why wouldn't you protest? And he said, we have been protesting for 20 months now, and nothing changed. So tell me, Ben, what are the achievements of these protests?
And look, this speaks to a fundamental question, which should be for anybody, not just for PSC, for any organisation that is trying to campaign in support of Palestinian rights. We consistently have to look at our strategy. What do we think it's effective? Do we think actually what we're doing, the way I always look at answering the question is something strategic, is it going to increase our power? Is it going to make it more likely that we'll achieve our aims? Or is it going to reduce our power? And ultimately, from PSC, all of that starts with what is our purpose? Our purpose is to contribute, is to support the Palestinian people to bring an end to their oppression, which to me means a complete dismantlement of Israel's system of oppression, an end to the practice of settler colonization, an end to the system of apartheid. Right now, the priority is stopping this genocide. But if we succeeded in getting a ceasefire, etc., actually the task of dismantling the infrastructure of oppression on which this genocide is founded continues. So our job is to support that, and the way in which we think we have to do that, and this is a message that comes directly to us from our Palestinian partners. When we ask them the question, Omar Barghouti delivered this once again. He says it many times. He came to PSC's AGM. And he says, our ask of you is you do us no harm. How do you do us no harm? What is it you should do here in the UK? And it is you have to end what enables this to continue, which is the complicity of your government, the complicity of your public bodies, all of your councils who are investing monies in companies that are supporting the oppression of the Palestinian people, and the complicity of those companies themselves. We need to stop getting corporations like Barclays Bank funding the companies that are supplying Israel with weapons, dealing in Israeli government bonds. So the same sort of tactic that was used to overcome apartheid in South Africa, turning Israel into a state where nobody is doing business as normal, where it becomes a pariah state, and that creates the body of external pressure. So when we're looking at the question of how do we do that, and the question of marches, when I ask myself this question, is there a single thing we could do? Is there one tactic that would achieve all of that strategy? No. If there were one thing we could do that would stop it, we'd be doing it. And believe me, Ahmed, I have a million suggestions put to me every week. I have people saying to me, Ben, why don't you make a call for everybody in the UK to stop spending money? Bring the entire economic system to a collapse. Why don't you say, don't spend money on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, start there, and the next week, until everybody stops spending money, and then the pressure on the government. And I understand the dynamic. How could we just bring everything to a halt? Why aren't you calling for everybody to go out and block the M25 persistently till it ends? And the answer is because we don't have the capacity to do that. These are not achievable aims. So you look at what is it we can do and what's going to increase our power. Now, if I'm asking the question, what's the point of marches? If someone said to me, Ben, do you think that if people just march in huge numbers, that is going to be the thing that brings this to an end? Of course not. But it's one of the things, one of the tools that we need to have. And what's the purpose of it? And I would say, and if you were asking me the question, to what extent is it effective? We look across, you've touched on one of them. One of the reasons why big demonstrations matter is about offering a message of solidarity to Palestinians that matters. And we know that, actually Palestinians at the moment are looking at a sense of being faced with overwhelming might and feeling that there is no support across the world. So when they see people demonstrating in huge numbers, it's not enough to bring an end to the bombs falling, to the forced starvation, but it gives them a sense of that fundamental message of solidarity, you're not alone. Secondly, there's a purpose which is about what I call building a community of resistance. And there's something about, you need something very, very visible that says to people, you're not alone. There are many, many hundreds of thousands and millions of people who share and are a powerful movement. They can come out in unprecedented numbers to mobilize for Palestine like no other issue in the country at the moment. And I see this all the time. I have people very early on in these demonstrations, in very particular, I used to get people from Arabic-speaking communities coming up to me saying, I feel a sense of despair at the moment. They weren't necessarily Palestinians who lost family members, but they were people who said, I don't feel I belong here anymore. I don't feel this is my country. When I see the support, when I see our government giving wholehearted support for Israel, until I come here. And then I realise there's a community of people who feel like me, and then people who don't belong to those communities, because you've been on the demonstrations, people coming from all walks of life, and they see ordinary members of their community coming out and feeling the same. So that's the second important purpose. The third is it does deliver a message to those in power. It's not enough. Anyone who thinks if a government sees 1 million people marching, then it will stop what it's doing, didn't learn any lessons during the Iraq war demonstrations when we had 2 million people marching and still we went to war. But if you look at, did that actually do something to make politicians pause for thought, to be aware of the strength of feeling? Yes, it did. So there is a sense, politicians aren't stupid, and they know what we know, that this is the longest sustained body of demonstration since the suffragettes. So it's telling them that this is a strong body of opinion. But the fourth and final thing, which I think is the most important, the purpose of the demonstrations are to galvanise people, to do the things that we think can have more immediate impact and effect. And that is to come and join the boycott and divestment campaigns that we are running across the country. So for example, we are calling on every local council, we're picketing, we're going into their meetings, we're lobbying them, we're protesting outside to stop investing in companies supporting Israel's system of oppression. We now have 10 councils that are committed to divest. This was a key ingredient. If you look at previous sort of social and political movements that achieved success, the anti-apartheid movement's a good example. Councils divesting was one of the huge milestones in creating the isolation of South Africa. We've launched campaigns now calling for every shop and every supermarket in the country to stop stocking Israeli goods. And those pickets are happening on a regular basis. It's our Don't Buy Apartheid campaign. We've got 100 branches. Last Saturday, we had people out in over 50 towns and cities across the UK picketing and outside their supermarkets. And I've lost count of the number of times when I go around the country, I meet people who say, I've become involved. I'm out now every Saturday. I'm either outside Barclays Bank or I'm at the supermarket or I'm involved in public meetings to educate people. All of this started for me when I came on a national demonstration. When I came on a national demonstration, I saw the body of support and I wanted to do more. So I went back to my local town, I joined one of your branches, I got involved. So that's the other bit, which is the marches serve to galvanise people, to get them involved in a whole range of different activities, boycott and divestment campaigns that can have meaningful impact, but it sustains them. You talk to me about people sustaining hope. When they come on a demonstration, they think after 20 months and with all of the repression, this is a movement of people who are not stopping. They're not stopping, they're still marching, and then, they're still going to their supermarkets, they're still targeting Barclays Bank, and that is how you build a sustainable movement. There's no simple solution. There's two ingredients. The ongoing resistance of the Palestinian people and external pressure. Neither of those by themselves is going to do it, you know. Nothing of decades of people resisting on the ground and trying to apply external pressure was enough to stop the genocide. But we are also now seeing, if you're also looking at impact, we are now starting to see a shift in that fundamental dynamic, which is, do we treat Israel as a normal state, or do we seek to boycott it, to divest from it, to isolate it? And we are seeing fundamental shifts, which we could talk about, in Israel's isolation.
We will talk a little bit about these shifts in a bit. But so many people think that the material change that we need to see right now immediately is an end of the genocide. And all of this great work that you have been doing and the changes that happen on the ground still did not stop the genocide, still did not even stop the British complicity in the genocide. We're still, even the Labour government, they said that they will cut trade relations with Israel, or they stop trade with Israel. And a week after that, they sent the British envoy to Israel for a trade. And we still know that the UK government, the Labour government, is still providing Israel with the F-35 parts. We know also that the Labour government, in 3 months, they provided Israel with ammunition and arms trade, more than 4 years of the Conservative Party. So many people think that all of what we have been doing during the past 12 months did not make any real change on the ground that would at least stop the genocide, or at least stop the British complicity in the genocide in Gaza. What do you say to them?
Well, look, the straightforward answer, and I come back to what I said. So, has any form of protest, whether it's marching, whether it's the boycott campaigns I've talked about, whether it's people taking direct action at arms factories, whatever, you know, whether it's the lobbying, has there been anything that's been able to stop the genocide? All that multiplicity of action, no. Has the Palestinian continuing resistance been enough to stop the genocide? No. So there isn't a simple magic bullet. You know, there's no one simple action, given the dynamics of power. You know, the overwhelming military force Israel possesses, and the support of complicit Western governments, and most importantly, the ongoing support of the world's foremost imperial power, the US. It's not been enough to stop it. All of the protests in the US, and there's been a shift in the US as well, has not been enough to stop their complicity. So does that mean that nothing can work, or that nothing is shifting? No, it doesn't. It's not been enough. But are we seeing this, as I said, this fundamental dynamic, which is we have to move to a point where actually continuing to support Israel becomes unsustainable? And what we're seeing is shifts in the political establishment.
Tell me more about this shift in the political, the media establishment.
So first of all, and we don't overplay it, because to some degree it's a shift in rhetoric, but if you look in the UK first of all, and I think there are two dynamics in this. So one is, you know, we've had 20 months of genocide. That should have been enough. What went on before October the 7th should have been enough. The evidence, the abundant evidence of colonization, of the killing of Palestinians, of ethnic cleansing, but it wasn't. But in these last 20 months, but in particular, I think, since March, since Israel tore up the ceasefire agreement, imposed the full blockade, was, as one UN official put it, nothing was getting into Gaza, no food, no water, no essential supplies, no medicine, nothing apart from bombs. That has started to shift people's sense, because it is so horrific that people are saying, I don't think I can support this any longer. If you want some bellwethers of that, people like Alistair Campbell, who were prepared in all sorts of rhetorical ways not to be actively opposing what Israel was doing, to stick to the framework of this is the state defending itself against a terrorist act. I might have some qualms with how many children it's killing, I don't like that. But there's the basic framework. And now are sitting there saying, I can't tolerate seeing children starving to death and hearing Israeli ministers being open about that's the intention. They've all heard what people like Smotrich are saying, and they know that the argument used, well, this guy's not in control of the government, doesn't hold water, he's a member of the government, and the day after he made his comments about we're going to annihilate everything in Gaza and force all the Palestinians out, Netanyahu said he's right. He endorsed his remarks. So we know this speaks to the sentiment across the Israeli political establishment, and it's becoming too much for people to stomach. I saw Ian Dale, someone I've encountered in interviews. He's a hostile interviewer to people like myself, Palestinians and those advocating for Palestinian rights. Last week he interviewed a minister of the Israeli government, and he virtually screamed at them and said, I've supported you for years. You know, people like me have supported you for years. No one's been more supportive of me. Now you've hung me out to dry with what you're doing. So what's he saying? He's saying, I can't stomach this. Now we can all make judgments about what that says about what he was prepared to stomach, but I can't stomach this. And now I'm going to be associated with it because I've supported you for so long. I'm associated. But you've seen more significant cracks across the political establishment. Lord Ricketts, who was the ex-head of the Joint Intelligence Committee, the head of the UK spy establishment, on Radio 4, effectively saying, in answer to the question about this being a genocide, well, look, the facts speak for themselves. Why do you need me to answer that question? But then saying there's no justification for there not to be a full arms embargo. We had 300 lawyers and judges last week calling for action, but raising the spectacle that it's a legitimate question, raising the proposition that Israel should be removed from the United Nations. So in other words, that conversation about to what extent can we continue justifying UK support for this is now across the political establishment. This is not sustainable. Our position is indefensible. Now that's ramping up the pressure on the government, hence what you refer to. David Lammy going in and changing his language, saying it's morally indefensible, it's intolerable. But what Smotrich is saying about the forced ethnic cleansing of Palestinians is monstrous. But of course you're right. What happened immediately after that? Well, within hours, as your colleague Matt Kennard revealed, another spy plane took off within hours. It doesn't happen without the authorization of the government, to go and provide intelligence to the IDF military in order to better target their bombing. As many have said, it's not about us being complicit, it's about us being an active participant. And a week later, off goes the trade envoy.
Exactly.
After the government says we're suspending these trade negotiations, which, by the way, were going nowhere anyway. So it's a pretty meaningless act. But even that meaningless act wasn't real, because off he goes to go to Tel Aviv to talk about, furthering the trade relationships. But here's the difference. Here's the difference. Once the government moves to a place where it is saying, this is intolerable, indefensible, and monstrous, then the necessary question that follows is, why are you arming it then? And you're in a much more difficult place to defend that decision. But the parameters for forcing the government to the position of a full arms embargo is now far more achievable. And that is about what Israel is doing. But it is about the fact there's something shifting. And the other bellwethers, if you look at the position of Britain, It looks around the world now and it sees something astonishing. The Chancellor of Germany starting to use rhetoric condemning Israel. Now, anyone who understands the history of Germany's support for Israel knows how significant that is. So that it's not enough. You know, our starting point on this would not be, here's what we want to achieve. We want to get the German Chancellor condemning Israel but taking no action. We want to get the Foreign Secretary condemning Israel but still continuing military cooperation. That's not what we want. We want the complicity to end. But are we in a position where that's far more likely than it was? Yes. But we have to sustain the pressure, because we know if Israel took certain steps, if it continues to do what it's doing now, allows a trickle of aid in, gives the sense of, okay, we're responding to this, or if another ceasefire comes soon but it isn't going to be held, then that relieves the pressure. And we have to say, actually, the priority now is you end the genocide, and the way that can happen is meaningful pressure from Western governments, particularly the US. So that's what you have to do. But when that moment comes, our task then will not be, fine, we got that, we go away, because what the political establishment will then want to do is return to the status quo, start telling us nonsense about two-state solutions and, you know, Israel's right to continue to exist as a state practicing a system of apartheid, pretending that apartheid doesn't exist. And we'll say, no, this has to fundamentally change, because all of this is built on the foundation of a system of rule that's totally unjustified, based, you know, on an ideology of Zionism that says one people have exclusive rights, right to the land, right to rule, right to self-determination, and the other people, the indigenous Palestinian people, have none of those rights and can be treated as second class.
So here is my worry. I totally agree with you that there's a huge shift that's taking place in the political establishment, not only in the UK but also in Europe. But Spain and Ireland, they're taking really good positions. And the media is a little bit changing. That is all good stuff. I totally support it. I'm happy about it. But my worry is that time is not in our side.
No.
And while we're waiting for this change to happen, the Palestinians in Gaza are being slaughtered. They're being starved to death. And the Gaza, the land of Gaza is shrinking. Every day Israel is taking more and more. So we don't have the luxury of wait. They don't have the luxury of waiting for further shifts in the political establishment. And some people argue, maybe it is time that we level up our action. For example, a friend, my colleague Omar Aziz, he wrote this piece a few days ago, and he said that humanity is being buried in Gaza. And then in his article, he encouraged the permanent occupations. But what do you think of these calls to permanently occupy some places, some avenues here in the UK and elsewhere? He argues that it played a huge role, for example, in the occupation of Wall Street in 2008. And maybe we need to do something like that to level up our action.
Well, I come back to what I'm saying, and I understand this, and you know, there is a responsibility, and believe me, you know, internally as an organisation, you constantly look at what else can we do, what else can we lever, but that has to come from an assessment of what is the power that we hold, what can we get masses of people to do, and how do we use that power in a way that is actually going to work and be effective. And if there were one simple ingredient, and I have this, if you know, people say to me, I said to you as an example, why don't we just stop spending money? Why don't we bring the entire system? Of course you understand the dynamic. Or why don't you take the 1 million people that march and take them to Parliament and get them all to stay there and refuse to move? Keep them there for a month if necessary. And you have to look at why those sort of actions don't happen, because they're not achievable, because we don't have that lever of power. But you have to keep pushing to the extreme. We're doing an action on on Wednesday, which is the first time this will have happened. But we need thousands of people to be there to make it happen, which is we are going to surround Parliament during Prime Minister's questions. to bring, and part of the frame of it is the government has been unable to find a red line, so we're going to bring it. We're asking people to wear red, we're asking them to come to Parliament, to surround Parliament, and we're asking MPs, members of Parliament, who are saying, I think there should be an arms embargo, to demonstrate that by walking out of Parliament and joining us. Now, do I think that is enough to bring the government crashing to the ground? No, I don't think it is. But you have to look at what are the actions that are sustainable, and what's the power we have compared to the power that the state has. And do we think we have a state that would be willing to use its power to repress the Palestine movement? Well, anybody who doesn't think so hasn't had their eyes and ears open in the past few months. So how can you get actions that as many people as possible can engage in that will use every lever of power? But as I said, there's room for, I don't think there's a single tactic. There is absolute room for protests of the size that we're mobilising, which are unique in terms of British history, in terms of the size and duration. They have their role, but they're not going to be enough. There is room for non-violent direct action, people who are taking that sort of action against arms factories. Is that enough? Has that succeeded in the past few months in stopping the supply of weapons to Israel? Has it brought a genocide to the end? Do we think if everybody tomorrow took over every arms factory in the UK, it would stop the genocide the next day? Of course not. There's not one single bullet. And what we're all confronting is the horror of what you've just said, because when do we need the slaughter to stop? Now. We need it to stop 20 months ago, and we know the precariousness of the situation. One of my personal sporting heroes, Eric Cantona, said something a month and a half ago. He was trying to make, I think, a point about the centrality of the struggle for rights of the Palestinian people to the broader struggle for justice and for the struggle, actually, for the rule of law and for the application of human rights. He said this, he said, if Gaza is lost, then humanity is lost. What he meant was, if this is allowed to continue, then forget any notion of saying we have a body of international law that can protect people, that genocide is strong enough to stop the greatest crime against humanity, the crime of crimes, genocide. The international order is strong enough. If it's not, then we're in the law of the jungle. We're in the situation where Trump wants us to be, where he can say, you know what I want? I'll tell you that here's a plan. Let's kick all the Palestinians out. Let's turn Gaza into a playground for the rich. And he was asked, on whose authority? He says, my authority. My authority. I'm the President of the United States. Is that the world we want? So, what Eric Cantona was talking about as well was how precarious the situation is. If Gaza is lost, in other words, he's saying that is a conceivable possibility. Is it feasible? You've lived in Gaza how many years of your life?
25 years.
You don't need me to tell you what have the people of Gaza suffered over the last 15, 20 years. If I'd said to you 6, 7, 8 years ago, there might come a moment where Israel's plan to mass ethnically cleanse everyone out of Gaza would be laid on the table for the world to see and might be supported by the most powerful nation on earth, would you have thought that was feasible, that might be on the table? Well, that's what we're confronting. So I understand everyone's sense of the urgency, but what we have to do is look at what are all the tools available to us and how do we use them in the best way we can, even if we know there's not one of them that is strong enough to stop the bombs falling tomorrow.
Yeah.
I don't have a better answer than that, Ahmed.
Ben, all of the tools that you have played were peaceful tools.
Yeah.
But the UK, the Metropolitan Police in January arrested many of the organizers of these events. And they also questioned, they asked two British politicians to be questioned at the police station, Jeremy Corbyn and John MacDonald. And they also arrested the Holocaust survivor, Stephen Cabo.
Yeah.
And he was summoned for a police and tribute. Yeah. Tell me what happened.
Well, this speaks to what I said, the attempts by the state to suppress the marches. And the previous government used every tool at its disposal to try to stop us marching. You'll recall the Home Secretary, when we were marching in November, called on the police to ban the march.
Yeah.
The police have used all of the tools available to them under the law, constant imposition of conditions, but actually not had the grounds to arrest huge numbers of people. And what happened in January was we were planning to march originally from the BBC to Whitehall. The reason for that was we wanted to fold into the march a protest about the BBC's complicity through its failure to report accurately, through its treatment of Palestinians, failure to platform Palestinians, treatment of Palestinians when they are brought on for interview. You've experienced
Tell me
this.
about it.
So have I. And what happened was, having agreed that, the police then intervened, and they were very direct with us under pressure from groups like the Board of Deputies, Jewish Leadership Council, on the basis that about 10 minutes away from the BBC, not where we'd be assembling, not where we'd be marching, there's a synagogue. And that there would be a service going on, and this would create harassment. And we said, where's the evidence of anybody being harassed in that synagogue, of anyone being threatened? And we reinforced the fact that on every single one of our demonstrations we have thousands of Jewish people marching, many of them, as you know, in an organised bloc. The police said they were going to impose powers to stop the march taking place. What we then decided to do, we said we'll reverse the march, because we don't care whether we start the BBC or end, so we'll get there at 3 o'clock. Service, even though we don't accept any arguments about the marches having an intention or actually harassing people in synagogues, we would have been arriving 2 hours after any synagogue service would have ended. And the police said no, they wouldn't allow that anyway, so we weren't going to be allowed there at any time on a Saturday. We then assembled at Whitehall on the Saturday. I announced from the stage that a delegation of trade union leaders, leaders of the movement, politicians, would walk towards the BBC. And we asked the crowd to part to allow us to do it. And we said, if we got to the BBC, we were going to lay flowers there to mark their complicity. It was a symbolic protest. If we were stopped by the police, which I anticipated that we would be, then we would lay the flowers at the feet of the police to mark their complicity on how they're repressing the protest. And what happened was a line of police at the top of Whitehall. We were conditioned to assemble in Whitehall. They had placed a line of police to prevent people coming out of Whitehall. When we got there, they parted, they beckoned us through. We got to a second line of police. When we got there, John McDonnell and myself said we want to walk to the BBC. They said you can't. We said we want a delegation of 25 of us to walk to the BBC. And they said they would need to seek permission. And we waited a few minutes, and then they beckoned Chris Nynam from Stop the War over. When he went over, he was violently arrested by 4 or 5 police officers. And at that point, I got hold of the megaphone. And I said what was very clear. I said, what the police now want is a scene of mass disorder. That's what they're trying to provoke. What we knew, why did I think that? Because I'd seen how they'd been acting all day. At every demonstration, there'd been a maximum of about 10 or 12 arrests. The police had brought at least 3 empty coaches to transport people away. We were approached in the morning by somebody from the London Ambulance Service who said, I just want you to know, we have been told all week, make sure you've got spare capacity, make sure there's lots of ambulances available, make sure there's hospital beds available across London because of the demonstration. Well, why? Because they were expecting lots of people to be injured. And I think they wanted to provoke a scene of mass disorder so that on Monday, the Home Secretary would have been able to go into Parliament and say, we now need to stop all of these protests. It is now clear these are violent protests. People have attacked the police. They were trying to set a trap for us. We didn't walk into it. People were astonishingly disciplined, and they know the principles on which we're marching. That this is a movement calling for justice, calling for an end to a genocide and on anti-racist principles. And the following day, I was called into the police station. I was charged. So at the moment, Chris Nynam and myself are on trial
Still
in
on
July.
trial.
In July,
Okay.
3 days in July, we'll be on trial. And other members of the movement, as you say, 2 MPs have been questioned. We're waiting to hear whether anybody else is going to be charged. And that day they arrested 77 people. They were hoping to arrest hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. They weren't able to do it. And that was because, as I said, people, and this is a little bit to me, I had people saying, well, why didn't we all go en masse, just charge through the police lines, go to the BBC? That would have shown the power of the movement. Now, what would have happened? The state would have then come in and had the grounds with the support of the entire political establishment to say mass scenes of disorder, we now effectively impose, bring in further laws, crush this movement, ban these marches, with the support of the political establishment to do so. So that, to me, is about how do we fight this strategically? And what they are also trying to do is make people frightened and intimidated come out. So what they were also hoping, the next march, virtually nobody would turn up. Subsequent march, we had over 200,000 people marching. So it's not repressing, people are not giving up. We will oppose this, but we have another battle because the government is now bringing in a new law or amendment to a bill in Parliament that is going to give the police powers to stop any protest happening within the vicinity of a place of worship.
Okay.
Now that has major implications. If that goes in, they're not defining vicinity. So it gives the police the power to say there's a synagogue somewhere around, you can't march. Or even, you want to march in support of the rights of lesbian and gay people, you want to hold a pride march, well, there's an evangelical church that takes a very different view. It's going to be harassing to them. You can't have that protest. So it's a really pernicious attempt to give additional powers because they've not been able. We still have some protection under the law, but they're trying to remove the continuing protection. So we are going to fight all of that. But the most important thing was actually on that day, we were right in the way we responded. We did not give the police what they wanted, which was scenes of mass disorder on the streets of London.
Let me ask you, why is the British state so afraid of the protests for Palestine?
Oh, because they're afraid of the strength of the movement. They're afraid because, obviously, if lots of people are protesting, and if they are joined, and one of the things that's important about the work that PSC does is we've got 16 trade unions affiliated to us. Now, they're not always adopting all the policies we want them to adopt. They're not taking enough action, for example, in addressing the fact that British workers have been put into a position of having to transport and handle weapons going to Israel. We want trade unions, we're calling on them to actually do what they've done previously, which, you know, in the 1970s, British workers were supported by the trade unions not to send weapons to Pinochet's Chile. We know why the trade unions are struggling with that, because we have the most draconian anti-trade union laws in the country. But we're saying push this to the absolute maximum so that your workers are not put in that position. But this frightens the government. It frightens the government if actually there is a powerful movement that's mobilising lots of people and there are campaigns calling for action to be taken. Yeah. We saw the impact of this at the last election. Yes, we got a Labour government with an overwhelming seat majority, but with an incredibly low proportion of the vote, and it lost seats in areas it should have won to independents standing on the issue of Palestine. In London, Palestinian activist Leanne Mohammed came within 500 votes of unseating Wes Streeton, who many see as the next leader of the Labour Party. He's now in an incredibly vulnerable. So all of these things, of course, worry them, which is why they want to repress the movement, because it's calling on them to end a policy that goes back decades of active, complicit support for Israel's oppression.
Talking about Labour, do you see any substantial differences between the Labour and the Conservatives on Palestine?
In terms of actual policy, minimal. No. I mean, look, 3 things happened in September after the July election. So we had some suspension of arms licenses, 8%, I think it was, of the licenses.
Not enough to make a difference.
Not enough to make a difference, but that wouldn't have happened under the Tories. We saw a renewal of funding to UNRWA. which should never have been removed and was what I would call low-hanging fruit. Again, it probably wouldn't have happened under the Conservative government. We saw the UK government at that point dropping its challenge to the ICC proceedings against Netanyahu and Gallant. But have we seen what I would call meaningful shifts? And here's a simple, this is not the limit of our ask, but it's a fundamental one: full arms embargo and an end to all military occupation, military cooperation, an end to all of that. Have we seen those sort of steps? No. But we are, as I say, seeing the pressure ramping up on the Labour Party. And the other thing that is there with the Labour government, which is not sufficient and not enough, but they have to listen to some degree more to certain voices across civil society and the trade union movement more than a Conservative government does. But we're not naive about that. You know, particularly under this government, which is deeply authoritarian. Starmer is run the party with absolute repressive centralisation and authoritarianism in terms of silencing dissent within the party. But yeah, the basic answer, is it materially better? No, it's not. We're still seeing the levels of complicity that we've seen under successive governments.
How do you evaluate the role of the trade unions when it comes to Palestine? I've been in some places where the trade unions were heavily criticized for not doing something substantial for Palestine, especially not cutting the funds to the Labour Party.
Well, look, again, and do I think that, the support of the trade union movement matters? Yes. We have affiliations from 16 trade unions. Does that matter in terms of what it means about building that institutional support for our demands? Yes. Most of those unions have good policy, including support for BDS, including support for a full arms embargo. So is that better than not having that support? Yes, it is. Those unions have been under massive pressure from successive governments to abandon that support, massive pressure from pro-Israel voices across the political establishment, including, shamefully, leading groups within the Jewish community. I'm talking about institutions like, or organisations like the Board of Deputies, the Jewish Leadership Council, who consistently lobby trade unions to tell them to stop supporting the demonstrations, to shift their policies, to cease affiliating to PSC. The Board of Deputies and others have supported calls for PSC to be a prescribed organisation. It is important that they've resisted that they've remained strong and that they've had the right policies. Do I think the trade unions are doing enough? No. And this is something I communicate regularly to the trade unions, and our core Palestinian partners are delivering that message very clear. We want more from the trade unions. And we know the limitations. We know that we have the most draconian anti-strike laws probably anywhere in Europe. We know that those prevent trade unions supporting strikes that are not about straightforward industrial issues. If they called for a general strike tomorrow to end the genocide, they would be breaking the law and risking every single worker who went out on strike being sacked from their work. And trade unions will always have a dynamic. We have to protect our workers' jobs and cannot take action that is going to make our members vulnerable to losing their employment. But do we think they're doing everything to push back against that, to push those to the limits, to take action, for example, in support of civil servants who have spoken up saying, I don't want to process the licenses. I think I'm in violation of injunctions from the ICJ. To support workers in the docks who are saying, I don't want to ship. I don't want to be handling these weapons that are being shipped out to Israel because I think it's wrong, but I also think I might be violating injunctions from the International Court of Justice. I might be complicit in committing genocide. We want the trade unions to take every lever at their disposal to support workers taking those sort of actions. So we want a hell of a lot more, but we also have to have an understanding of the importance of the support we've got, but use the influence we've got to demand and to push the trade unions to do more. It's a difficult balance. It's a difficult conversation sometimes. But do I think trade unions are doing enough? No, I don't. I don't think they're doing enough.
What practical steps do you want to see the trade unions doing now?
Well, I've sort of outlined some. I think most trade unions have a policy supporting a full arms embargo. That's important. But what we want from those trade unions, as I say, is to push to the absolute limits. How do we make sure that we as trade unions are not complicit in this and our workers are not made complicit? So how do we actually, within the frameworks that I've talked about, the most draconian anti-trade union laws, how can we still push to the absolute limit the ability of our workers and support workers who want to say, I don't want to be complicit? And we've been calling through regular workplace days of action, workers to take action in their workplaces. We want workers to be able to walk out to demonstrate support for Palestinian rights. We want workers in every company across the country to say, how might my company and my workplace be complicit? It might be all sorts of ways. It might be, you know what, I go into my canteen and what they're providing me with is Coca-Cola. I want that to end. I don't want Coca-Cola as a complicit company. I want to force my workplace to stop stocking Coca-Cola. Find an alternative. So that all of these things about mechanisms for how trade, in every workplace we're seeing people saying, how do I end my complicity? If my company is investing in a pension scheme that's complicit, end that investment. And so we want trade unions being creative about looking at every aspect of what their work, how their workers are being made complicit and supporting them to take action. But the most material way at the moment is through the arms trade and through the shipping of weapons to Israel. And how do we end the complicity of workers, the forced complicity of workers in those actions?
Thank you. Let's go to something really off topic. Not really off topic. But I was asked by one of the journalists a few days ago on what I think of liberal Zionism. And then I thought about it, liberal and Zionism.
Yeah.
What do you think? Do you think there is any contradiction in terms?
Well, yeah. I mean, look, straightforwardly, I mean, there's often been an argument that liberal Zionists in some ways are worse because they carry with them the pretense of the idea that Israel is effectively a liberal democracy, that Zionism was not a problematic ideology, but the problem is it's gone wrong. So we've got the wrong government in power.
That it can be fixed.
Yeah,
Zionism.
that it can be fixed, that we can return to the sort of, that there was a status quo, that Israel is in a better place. This is the narrative at the moment. We're seeing very, very strong language, for example, from Ahmed Alnaouq, deeply critical, using phraseology like genocide, talking about war crimes. But is he doing so from a perspective of saying, actually there's something fundamentally wrong with the entire project from the point of the establishment of the State of Israel and the ideology of Zionism that justified that? So yeah, it's a contradiction in terms. For me, straightforwardly, Zionism is a racist ideology that led to a movement that, in terms of its impact upon Palestinians, is racist both in ideology and in terms of effect. For me, how do I understand Zionism? I say, well, before 1948, Zionism meant the claim of the right of the Jewish people to found a state in Palestine. And the only way that could have happened, given the demographics in Palestine and the size of the indigenous Palestinian population, is through ethnic cleansing and the dispossession of the Palestinian people. So it was always a philosophy that said these people's rights are going to be privileged over these people's rights. And since 1948, Zionism to me means support for Israel's right to exist as a state that is a Jewish supremacist state, that says Jewish people have rights and Palestinians don't. and is establishing that regime of Jewish supremacy across all of historic Palestine in different ways. You know, as you know, if you're a Palestinian living in the occupied Palestinian territory of the West Bank and Gaza, then you know the imposition of that regime of Jewish supremacy works through a mechanism of military occupation in different ways in Gaza and in the West Bank. If you're a citizen of the State of Israel, then it works through a mechanism of apartheid that simply denies you full rights as a citizen of the state. You're a second-class citizen. Your rights are circumscribed. So, but in any shape or form, Israel does not have a right to exist as that ethno-nationalist supremacist state. So the idea, if you like, reframe it as this: I'm a liberal Jewish supremacist, I'm a liberal ethno-nationalist. Well, you know, there's a straightforward contradiction there.
It is as saying that I am a liberal racist.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
Ilan Babi, at the beginning of the genocide, they said this is the beginning of the end of Zionism.
Yeah.
Do you think Zionism is dying as an ideology?
You know, I mean, we have an argument, and there are people who frame the task at the moment as we have to dismantle Zionism. And I, when I hear that, say, what does that actually mean? Because look, as I've said, Zionism is a racist ideology. What matters right now? What matters is the dismantling of the political system that's been established on the back of that ideology. Now, if we succeeded in that aim, if Israel ceased to exist as a Jewish supremacist state, if the entire system of apartheid was dismantled, which also means that the Palestinians scattered across the globe would be able to return. And if we established across the territory a system of rule in which no people had privileged rights over the other. And if there were still some people who maintained a belief in Zionism, etc., but it was having no material impact, is that problematic? No, it's the material impact. So do I think it's the end of what I think Ilan Pappé was talking about, as I understood it, and I would agree with him on this, that we may, but it's not a given, it's not a given, but we may have reached a turning point with this where actually the possibility of trying to project Israel as a liberal democratic state and trying to find a way of covering that contradiction of it's a liberal democracy that also gives privileged rights to one people is unsustainable when people see the logical endpoint of that, which is a full-blown genocide. That this now has so revealed the face of Israel and also the nature of who is in power in Israel and likely to remain in power, or a worse version even than what we've got now, that actually means the system is not going to be unsustainable. Here's the bit where I might disagree with Ilan, that's not an inevitability, because what's required for that is that actually the rest of the world is simply not going to sustain or allow that. And that means that actually across the world there are enough progressive people who will be able to employ power to ensure that that is no longer supported. And that's the bit that's only true if we make it true.
Yeah.
You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
You know, if we're learning something at the moment, it's about, and if we look at the rise of the far right across the world, we're in a battle at the moment. I'll go back to what Eric Cantona said about this battle against genocide and for Palestinian rights is a battle for what type of world do we want to inhabit. Now, is it a given that the far right are not going to win that battle? I don't think that is a given. And that depends upon people coming together in communities of resistance, both to resist that, but also to give an absolute clear sense of what's the alternative model, actually. What do we want as a system, you know, of political systems that are built on a completely different set of principles than that?
Tell me more about if you may, about the Israeli lobby in the UK.
Yeah.
Is there an Israeli lobby in the UK? And if yes, how powerful they are?
Well, I mean, almost that's a redundant question, I think, for anyone to deny that there are extremely powerful groups lobbying on behalf of Israel across the political establishment is not observing what's a straightforward reality. And we see that operating in all sorts of different ways. We see within political parties, groups like Labour Friends of Israel, Conservative Friends of Israel that do have, I think, significant influence. We see the influence, and this is one of the problematic issues at the moment, deeply problematic, that those pro-Israel groups that are lobbying on behalf of Israel contain leadership groups within the Jewish community. And I'm talking like groups like the Board of Deputies, the Community Security Trust, Jewish Leadership Councils, that are making fundamental part of their purpose, putting pressure where they have the ability to put pressure on institutions, on government, to adopt pro-Israel positions. We've seen this in operation in all sorts of ways in the past 20 months. Yeah. One example is the pressure that's been put on the BBC in relation to its coverage. This argument that the BBC, extraordinary argument that the BBC is broadcasting from an anti-Israel perspective, but we saw this pressure employed with the range of groups putting pressure on the BBC with a documentary in relation to the experience of children in Gaza, and then the subsequent pressure that's resulted in the BBC deciding not to show a second documentary, which is looking at the impact upon the health sector in Gaza, the devastation of hospitals, the targeting of health workers, and that's now being shelved by the BBC. Well, I know directly, because we've heard the BBC say it, that this is because they're concerned about the political consequences and the attacks might come to them if they're releasing that documentary.
Have you been, you personally or the PSC, been under attack from the Israeli lobby here in the UK?
Well, that's been going on for years. I mean, you go back 15 years ago, I think it was, 2010, an Israeli think tank identified support for boycott, divestment and sanctions as the biggest strategic threat to Israel. Produced a report, a group called the Reut Institute. They identified various groups that they saw as central to the growing support for boycott, divestment and sanctions. They identified the UK as, in their words, a major hub in this sort of network of people trying to delegitimize Israel. And they identified PSC as one of the core organizations. One of the responses of the Israeli government to that think tank's report was to set up a Ministry of Strategic Affairs that had as its remit trying to destabilize the Palestine Solidarity movement globally through narratives of anti-Semitism, support for terrorism. One of its early acts was to produce a list of organizations whose leaders were banned from entry into Israel. PSC was one of the 20 groups listed. Our chair was one of the first people globally to be turned away at the border, trying to go in. The Ministry of Strategic Affairs produced a report called something like Terrorists in Suits, which was trying to say, here are the network of groups across the world that have close links to terrorism. It had an entire section of the report that was devoted to the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. Some of the groups I've mentioned in the UK, groups like Campaign Against Anti-Semitism would be another one, have campaigned for ages against the PSC, called for all trade unions and other institutions to break all their links with the PSC. Lord Warney, who used to be the government's advisor on extremism, regularly called for no politician to engage with the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. I've ended up on the front page of the Times on a number of occasions in the last 20 months. Once when I called for a mass lobby of Parliament. I had articles saying that I'd called for violent insurrection and the overthrow of Parliament. As you know, as I said, personally, I'm facing charges at the moment. So we know the attempts to undermine the PSC. That comes from pro-Israel groups, both in this country and elsewhere.
Will they succeed?
Well, they're not succeeding at the moment. And if you look at what's happened, and this has been on steroids since October the 7th. On October the 7th, PSC was at the Labour Party conference. We held a fringe meeting. We always have a stall at party conferences in order to reach out to members, to try and inform and influence members of parties to create pressure inside parties. There were calls for us to be banned. There were MPs who turned up at our stall to be photographed, who were shamed in the national papers, called on to apologise for being near us. And here we are 20 months later. At that point, PSC had something like 65,000 people who subscribed to us, who asked to receive information about our actions. Now it's close to 300,000. We had about 70 branches, now it's over 100. And as I said, historically, we've been able to mobilise up to 200,000 people. We're now 20 months in of regularly mobilising that and many, many more, as we've talked about, up to 1 million people. So no, it hasn't succeeded, but it doesn't mean the attempts won't go away, because I think, my view, and I go back to what I said about strategy and about what it is that we have to do, which is to end all of the complicity across our society. The only mechanism I know through history of doing that is to build a mass movement. A movement that has, huge numbers of people participating. So in every town and city, you will find people on the streets advocating for Palestinian rights, whether they're protesting, whether they're in their local councils, picketing them, going in there, calling for divestment, whether they're outside of branches of Barclays Bank or picketing supermarkets, bringing the calls for justice and the calls for boycott, divestment and sanctions to every town and country across the UK. So our ability to do that has grown multiply since October 2023, but we're going back to this horrible paradox that we're talking about, which is none of that's been able to stop the genocide, and what's fueling all of that is people's horror of what they're seeing in the genocide. But no, it's not been successful. The lobbying has not been successful. It doesn't mean it's not going to go away.
Yeah.
There are lots of people who would like the outcome of the trial in July for myself and Chris Nynham to be put in prison. We're going to vigorously contest all of the charges against us. But I don't expect the attempts to silence us, to stop us, to demonise us, to go away.
Well, it goes without saying that there is now a huge outpouring support for Palestine from across the country.
Yeah.
Do you think that is durable, or do you think it will dissipate when or if the genocide ends?
Well, look, history tells us, and we know, that when, if the daily massacres and slaughters of Palestinians comes to a halt in Gaza, if people are not seen on their screens, Palestinians being forcibly starved, if that comes to an end, then for the people who at the moment are finding this horrific, and therefore it's going to the top of their agenda of their political concerns, some of that will go away. We know that. And we saw that in 2014 in a much shorter period of time of, an intense bombardment and slaughter of Palestinians over 50 days. But do I think things will return to the sort of norm? No, I don't, because I think there is a whole generation that's been politicised on this issue, who have grown up in the way there was a generation politicised over the Iraq War, for whom Palestine is still going to continue to be a matter of deep concern, who have understood some of the messages we've been giving them, which is this doesn't end until the entire system of injustice is dismantled, and that's an ongoing task, and who will simply not believe when they're told again the narrative, Israel's a liberal democratic state, it should be treated as an ally, it's a great friend of the UK, it has the same value system as we want to have, it supports human rights, it should be treated like an ordinary member of the community of nations. They're not going to stomach that, they're not going to believe it, because they'll say, I've seen what Israel is capable of doing, I don't believe any of that. And I think from that perspective, that key task that we've had which is that if you are progressive, if you have a set of values, the way you care about principles of justice and social justice and rights, and you care about issues of climate justice, then here's where you should stand on the issue of Palestine. This should be a central issue of concern. You should look at this and say this is one of the world's longest standing injustices and the worst example of an ongoing system, institutionalized system of racist oppression. I stand against it.
Ben, let's end with 3 messages. A message to the Palestinian people in Gaza who are enduring a genocide, and a message for your supporters and the pro-Palestine movement here in the UK, and finally a message to Keir Starmer and the British government.
Well, my message to the Palestinian people is we remain inspired by the astonishing and continuing endurance and support of the Palestinian people. Sometimes we say that as a cliche. When I reflect, when I have a moment to pause and reflect on all the horror we've seen, some of the things that will stick with me will be those images at the moment where the ceasefire was called and Palestinians began to march towards what was left of their homes in the north of Gaza. And I remember hearing one Palestinian say, I'm going to go back to the ruins of my home, I'm going to dig with my hands to find the remains of my children, and I'll give them a proper burial. And that absolute refusal to submit, and the people saying those things and doing those things weren't stupid. They knew the risk of a renewal of slaughter, but they were saying they were not going to submit, they were going to endure. And alongside that, and you know what I'm talking about, Ahmed, the Palestinians who have the privilege of standing on side and seeing them go into Parliament to try to talk to MPs, or standing on platforms who've lost dozens of their family, but are honouring their memories and continuing to endure. So my message to the Palestinian people is one of continuing to be inspired, but saying you do not stand alone. And here in the UK, there are many, many, many people who understand the injustice to which you're subject and stand opposed to it. My message to the Solidarity movement is to pass on the message that Omar Barghouti gave us, as I said at our AGM. He said this, I know you're weary, and I know we've all had moments of despair and thinking, how do we bring this to an end? But we don't have that luxury. We simply don't have that luxury, because the Palestinian people do not have the luxury of genocide fatigue, of despair. So we have to keep doing the absolute maximum, everything that is within our compass and our power. Keep reviewing, are we doing the right things? But we have to keep going, because otherwise, if we don't, then we are failing on that injunction that Omar Barghouti gave us, which is do not do us any harm. And my message to Keir Starmer is, I'm hearing you now issue words that you didn't issue back in October, when we already knew a genocide was unfolding, and you were telling the world that it was legitimate for Israel to cut off food, water. You're an international human rights lawyer. You didn't know that that was a war crime. You seem to have forgotten everything that you've been trained. Well, right now you've been shamed. You've seen the consequences of that. What happens when people have water and food cut off to them? They starve to death. And now you're saying it's intolerable and it's not acceptable. But we're not interested in those words. We're interested in you taking action. And you will be judged by history. If you do not, you're already going to be judged by history. But if right now, if the forcible starvation of a people is not a red line for you, where is it? So your task right now is to end all of British military cooperation, introduce a full arms embargo, meaningful sanctions on Israel, or you will be judged and you will be held accountable for what you've done and what you continue to do.
Ben Jamal, thank you very, very much for joining me today.
Thanks.